Good morning, and welcome to what we believe is the first ever FLRA Holocaust Remembrance event. This is yet another special emphasis event where one of our own FLRA employees has offered to host the event and share their personal experiences. Today's event is hosted by Hadro's Office Director, Michael Wolf, who we all know. And Michael has had a lifelong education on the Holocaust through family members and family events commemorating the event. Today, through the wonders of modern technology, we will have a multimedia presentation from Michael's father in Seattle, Washington, and his cousin in Richmond, Virginia, who both survived the Holocaust. And I'm now going to turn the event over to our real host, Michael Wolf, who grew up in St. Louis. So the Wolves are all over the country right now. Michael, please welcome Michael. Right.
I'm going to try to be equally brief and turn it over to the speakers for today. So I'd like to do introductions. I'd like to introduce you to Inge Horowitz and Ernie Wolf. Inge's father, Alfred Windmuller, and Ernie's mother, Paula, were brother and sister. So Inge and Ernie are first cousins. And I normally refer to Ernie as dad, but today I'll make an exception. Inge holds a bachelor's degree in occupational therapy and a master's in special education. She enjoyed careers in occupational therapy and as an educational consultant in Richmond, Virginia. In retirement, Inge continued serving in leadership roles in the field of learning disabilities. She also chaired monthly book talks and even tried her hand at flipping condos. And I understand she was pretty good at that too. Inge spent 20 years as president of the Holocaust Memorial Cemetery in her community and has been an active person in the Virginia Holocaust Museum since its founding. She also, at the Holocaust Museum, developed its survivor room. She conducts videotaped interviews of survivors and World War II veterans and serves as a docent. Inge is a family historian. Along with her mother and daughter, she produced the Windmuller Family Chronicle, which I have up in my office and I intended to bring down here to pass around as we go through this morning. She helped to organize 2 worldwide family reunions, which she'll talk a little bit about. Inge was married to Harold Horowitz for 66 years until he passed away about 12 weeks ago. They have 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandsons. And in just a moment, you'll hear from Inge. Let me do the second introduction, and then fade off to the side, and you can hear from Inge and Ernie. Ernie Wolf is a graduate of Queens College, Purdue University, and the University of Buffalo, where he earned bachelor's and master's degrees in chemistry and an MBA. During his first 20-year career, he conducted research on high-energy military fuels and had marketing responsibility for pharmaceuticals and medical diagnostic products throughout Europe. During Ernie's second 20-year career, he was an entrepreneur inventing and manufacturing power moonroofs for automobiles. In retirement, Ernie's been an adjunct professor teaching international business. He spent time serving on the board of several not-for-profits and 20 years as a certified ski instructor, which would be more fun. I know. Now, using Inge's family book as a guide, Ernie developed and published the 4th edition of the Wolf Family Chronicle, which I also left upstairs. Maybe I'll sneak up there and bring it down. He recently moved from St. Louis to suburban Seattle, Washington, where he remains active in his large 50 or over 50 condo community. He's married to his Purdue sweetheart, Vivian Wolf. Has been for almost 64 years, and they have 3 children. 2 who live there, 1 who lives right here. 8 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild plus another on the way. So That's Inge and Ernie. As soon as Inge uses her mouse to tap once on her screen, she's going to have control of these PowerPoint files, and we'll be able to begin her presentation. So, Inge, without more from me, would you like to begin?
Okay. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, people in the audience. I've been asked to share memories of my childhood living under Nazi rule in Germany. Oh, that's the two of us. Not in another slide. I'm trying to advance it.
She loses control. She just lost control. Oh, sorry.
I was born in 1930, and when I was 3 years old, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Here you see the house to which I was born, number 19 Weststraße in Beckum, Germany. I lived here until I was 7.5 years old. I was the 5th generation of the Windmiller family in this house. Beckum, our town, is about 56 miles from the Dutch border in Westphalia. And in 1933, the total population was approximately 20,000, small town, and there were approximately 100 Jewish citizens. Here you see a picture taken in 1901 of my great-grandfather, Abraham, sitting in front of the house. The house had been in the family since 1800, when it was purchased by his father, Solomon. Here we see my grandfather, Solomon, another Solomon, on his 70th birthday, and he is here with his 7 children, and some of them were married, their spouses, and a few of his grandchildren. This is me. This is my mother, my little brother Herbert, my father, the 4th born. Over here, well, let's start here. Hugo is the oldest. Then came Kurt, and then Paula, who is Ernie's mother and Michael's grandmother. This is Ernie and his sister Anne and Fred Wolf, the father. This is the youngest of the children, Ilse, and you will hear more about her later. Fred was the youngest of the sons. This is Hugo's wife, Hugo the oldest. Here's Gerda. Kurt again, you'll hear more about him, and his wife, Herta. Finally, Ernest, who never married and settled in Seattle. This is my father. Our family was integrated into the fabric of the community in Beckum. We had good neighbors. I had friends as a child growing up. My grandfather raised his 7 children when his wife, my grandmother Jenny, died in the influenza epidemic in 1912. He was a wonderful, loving man. And I remember when he took Herb and me on walks, at the end of which we always stopped at a confectionery store where he bought what we called Schwarze Klumpkes. They were licorice drops. This is a picture of Kurt and his wife, Herta. In January of 1933, Hitler assumed power. In April of 1933, a law was passed, the exclusion of non-Aryans from civil service. And that same year, in October, on the 26th, 1933, Kurt committed suicide. He had worked at the stock exchange, and he was not able to work anymore, and he saw no future for himself. And very sadly, this promising young man committed suicide. This was the trigger that caused my grandfather to know that something had to be done. And he suggested that his youngest child, Ilse, then 22 years old, prepared to immigrate to America. And though she was already a stenographer, she learned manicure so that she could find work right away. In 1935, the beautiful bride, they hadn't been married very long before Kurt died, Herta also committed suicide. This is a picture of my grandfather in 1935. He was 73 years old here. When he was arrested, because he removed a sign that the Nazi Party had pasted on the house announcing a Nazi Party meeting. As always, under at the bottom of these signs was the warning, Juden unerwünscht, meaning Jews not welcomed. The grounds for his arrest was stated, for the protection of the people and the state, you have, through your behavior, considerably endangered the public peace and order. The criminal case against him was that he destroyed state property. And as part of this, this is the German and this is the translation. This reads, the accused is of Jewish descent. In view of the position the state and the party takes towards the Jewish race, the accused has all the more reason to be especially careful and to avoid any action that could cause provocation. He was sentenced to 6 weeks in the local jail. And this is an article that appeared in the local paper after the arrest. On Saturday, some persons were sentenced at the court to several weeks in prison for damaging posters which had been affixed to their homes. The names of the saboteurs of the National Socialist Movement: there was a woman, Mrs. Franz Windhöfel, 3 weeks prison. The innkeeper Ferdinand Hagedorn, 3 weeks. The priest Strateman, 3 weeks. And the last of this famous group, the 73-year-old cattle Jew, Solomon Windmüller, 6 weeks prison. All were taken into custody. The Jew, Windmüller, was imprisoned immediately. After the 6 weeks, he came home, he secluded himself, he was depressed, and the family said his spirit was broken. October 1935, a couple of months later, Ilse left for the United States. And in December, Hugo and Ernest took him to a resort to recover. But there he committed suicide. I well remember when they brought his body home and there was a pall over the house. This was the trigger that made my father realize there was no future for us anymore in Germany. And he was able to visit Ilse in the United States. From that distance, he could see that he had to come back and make preparations to leave. In 1936, when I was 6 years old and of age to go to school, I could not go to the public school because there was a law called numerus clausus, which excluded Jews from public school. It means there were no seats for Jews. I remember, and this is my class, the Jewish children in town, 8 of us, went to the synagogue, and we were taught there by the leader. He was not a rabbi, he was a teacher. And this is me, and this is the teacher's son, Zev Raphael, with whom I'm still in touch. He lives in Haifa, Israel. 3 of my classmates did not survive the war. This boy, this girl, and this girl. We were shunned by our neighbors, and the child I used to play with all the time, Klärchen Walter, was never allowed to come up to my house and play with me anymore. Shops could not sell to Jews except after hours. I should tell you the names of my classmates. There was Julius and Lotte and Uschi, who perished. This is the house in Beckham of my great aunt, Tante Bernardina, we called her. She was married to my grandfather's younger brother, Bernardina Hoffman Windmiller. And there was an incident after my brother and I had walked to her house, visiting her. On our way home, we were stopped by a group of Nazi youth in their uniforms. They put their bicycle across the sidewalk where we were walking and forced us into the street. And they taunted us, followed us as we walked home in the street, and told us Jews were never to walk on sidewalks and we should know better. I must say that there were a few good neighbors who dared to visit my mother and father, who offered them help and sometimes shopped for my mother. This is a picture of Ernie, my brother Herb, and I in 1937. This was our last visit to Schlichten, where Ernie lived, just before we immigrated. And this is Herb and Ernie's sister Anne and myself at that time. My observations as I look back. Hitler's party actually won in an election, the Nazi party, and he was appointed chancellor. He convinced the German people that he had their best interest at heart. His way was the only way out of hard times. He would make Germany superior above all other nations. And a song permeated the airwaves in Germany. Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in die Welt, which means Germany, Germany, over all, over everything in the world. He blamed the Jews for Germany's misfortune, We numbered 505,000 out of a total population of 67 million, or somewhat less than 0.75%. The slogan was Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. And he claimed that the Jews were out to kill all Aryans, all Germans who were Aryans. They had that there was a Jewish and communist conspiracy to kill them. Hitler and his spokespeople lied, and the people believed. They were gullible. Hitler had his own news media that spewed propaganda and disparaged the standard press. The paper was called Der Stürmer. He provoked disorder and then claimed he was the only one capable of restoring order. He generated the myth that he was the supreme savior. What lessons can I draw from all of this? Can we draw? Alex Levenstein, a survivor who lived in Richmond, said, "Hate hurts." And there were bumper stickers made. Another survivor in Richmond, the wise Anne Fisher, said, "Hatred quickly creates a following for itself." Elie Wiesel, "You must not be indifferent. The opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference." In the Jewish Talmud we read, "To save one life is to save a world." Never forget, and Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And a final lesson, never forget that there were in every country resistors, upstanders, not bystanders, but upstanders, rescuers who hid Jews, and partisans who fought back. They saved lives at great risk to their own lives. They tell us about the human capacity for decency and goodness. My life after and since the Holocaust, or my immigration. Holocaust education and Holocaust remembrance have driven some of my avocational interests, as Michael already told you. I felt the imperative of the Hebrew word zakor, which means remember. I volunteered at the Virginia Holocaust Museum since its founding and started the ROHA committee while the exhibits were being developed. ROHA stood for Research, Oral History, and Archives, a very ambitious committee which later divided into parts. And I served about 10 years as a docent there. And as he told you, I conducted interviews, about 48, of survivors and liberators and rescuers. Represented at the museum are the names of children. 1.5 million children were lost in the Holocaust. And this children's exhibit, which you see here, consists of layers of clear plastic panels with names on them, and the names appear to go on forever, 1.5 million. It is the work of the artist who designed most of the exhibits, Diana Gabay. Also at the museum is a picture of John Windmiller, it appears in a reproduction of the ship, the St. Louis. John Windmiller was on that ship with his parents and his brother. And many of you in the FLRA know that name because John Windmiller taught labor relations at a university that the name escapes me.
ILR.
Where?
LR.
No, the university up in
Purdue.
not Purdue. No.
Cornell.
Cornell. Yeah. Thank you. There's also a picture of Max Windmiller, who was a hero in the resistance. He worked with the Westerville group in Holland, saving many Jewish children as they were escorted from Holland across Belgium, across France, and then over the Pyrenees into Spain where it was safe. He was a wonderful person, and I want to show you a prototype of a book that is being written about him. It is now with the publisher. To Save One Life, Max Windmiller and the Dutch Rescue and Resistance Movement. The book is written by Daniel Sachs. We look forward to that. This is the Holocaust Memorial in Richmond at a cemetery, in a larger cemetery. And in this section, there are the graves of the founders of this memorial, including among the founders were the three Windmiller brothers who settled in Richmond. My father, Alfred, his oldest brother, Hugo, and his youngest brother, Fred. This memorial they were very far-sighted in placing this here and paying with their meager incomes at the time. The refugees and survivors of the Holocaust wanted to remember those they had lost. And on the original memorial were 200 names. Since then, it has been expanded and there are now 460 names. It turns out this was the second earliest memorial to the Holocaust in all of North America. The earliest is in Indianapolis. In 1998, it was designated as a historic landmark in Virginia, and it is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Fred Windmiller was the first president of the cemetery and Holocaust Memorial, and I was the president from 95 until 2015. I chaired many events there. This is a map of the world, and it is a page from the Windmiller Chronicle, which we compiled in 1981, when at that time we found our family living on every continent. And here you can see, even in Japan, the Dutch ambassador to Japan at that time was a relative. We compiled our book based on information that my uncle Fred Windmiller had gathered in the 1930s about the family. He saw what was happening. He traveled to city halls, to cemeteries in Westphalia, where our family lived, and in Holland, and put together the first Windmiller Family Chronicle and brought it to America, 100 copies, when he came in 1938. When we wrote to the survivors, we learned that 200 of our family members had perished. In 1995, we held the first Windmiller family reunion in upstate New York. 224 people attended. They came from 9 countries and Puerto Rico. And we realized in the meantime, by 1995, we had been contacted by a man in Germany named Herbert Schurmann, living in Emmerich. He created for us a scroll of our whole family tree. It was 24 feet long. And he did research and sent more names. And at the time of our reunion, we knew that 240 members of our family had perished in the Holocaust, more than the number who had gathered there. The attendees. This is Hugo Crick, a man in Beckham who became Beckham's conscience after the war. He wrote letters. He found out where the remnants of the Jews from Beckham were living. He corresponded with them and he visited them. My mother had a huge correspondence with him, and all of it is now archived at the Virginia Historical Society. In one of his letters, he ended, he wrote about a lecture that he had given.
It's not coming. I think somebody clicked it, and now you can do it.
Okay. And he sent a copy of his lecture that he gave in 1980 to a gathering of citizens in Beckham, where he read the names of the 33 former Jews of Beckham who perished in the Holocaust. And this is what he wrote in his letter. At the end of my talk, I said, for the first time after the war, I want to read to you now publicly the names of these victims of the Nazi time who were at one time our fellow citizens. I ask you to rise. The audience rose and listened in silence and were deeply shaken as the names were read. I have returned to Beckham 3 times. And here in Beckham's Central Park stands this memorial, thanks to Hugo Crick. He insisted that the city create this memorial. Engraved on the memorial is the inscription which translates, let it not come unto you, all ye that pass by. Behold and see if there be any pain like unto my pain, which is done unto me. A quotation from Lamentations. The 3rd time I visited was 2008. My daughter Rita came with me, and we went there to witness Günther Demnig placing Stolpersteine. I will explain to you later what Stolpersteine are. This is my mother's youngest sister, Thea, my favorite aunt, and her husband, Walter. They were victims, and on that list of names that Hugo Crick displayed. First, they were confined in what was called das Judenhaus, Jew house, in Münster, a larger city. They were crowded into one room with her parents, my grandparents. Her brother, Herman, had immigrated to Brazil, and he obtained visas for the 4 of them. My grandparents went to Brazil, but Thea would not leave Walter. He was ill with tuberculosis, he was malnourished, and she would not leave him. Walter died of lack of food and medical attention. Thea was deported to the Warsaw Ghetto, where it is assumed she died. Here is the man, Walter Demnig, really an artist, who creates Stolpersteine and has placed them all over Europe. This is the one he created for Thea. Beckham sent him the names of all of their victims and the information that, as much as they knew about them, he created these stumbling stones. That's how that is translated. They come, you can see it, he's holding one in his hand. He puts a cap on a block of concrete, and then he brings a helper with him. They drill a hole in the sidewalk, and they insert this block into the sidewalk, and the brass plaque is then level with the sidewalk to be there forever in front of the house where Thea lived, and in front of every house where the Jew who perished lived. This is a picture of Günther Demnig and myself in front of the house, or the place where Jeanette Windmiller lived. It's now a bank. The house is no longer there. And the Stolperstein reads, "Here lived Jeanette Windmiller, born 1884, deported 1942 to Riga, murdered." This is the Dutch Red Cross document pertaining to Bernardina Windmiller, my Tante Bernardina. Her birth date, birthplace, her last address in Holland, where she had fled to where her daughter had married to a man in Holland. It says deported on May 19th, 1944, from the Dutch holding camp Westerbork to Auschwitz. On May 22nd, 3 days later, 1944, in Auschwitz, von Gas versticken in Overleden, overcome by the gas. This is the Stolpersteine that were placed in front of Bernardina's house, one for her and one for her daughter. Günther Demnig of Cologne, Germany, has laid over 48,000 Stolpersteine in 18 countries in Europe, all across Europe. We met him. He is a driven man. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. I'll be glad to answer questions later if that an opportunity arises.
So thank you, Inge. And questions and discussion, or maybe some stories you might have after we hear the second presentation. And then hopefully we've got a good amount of time for discussion and whatever you have. So, did you unmute him?
I did.
Okay, good.
I didn't start the slide.
All right.
So hold on just a moment and we'll get ready for number 2 here. Let's see. All right, here it is. And
All right. Do you want to see if you have control of the slides? Okay. Very good. You got it.
Okay, very good. I'm Ernest Wolf, Michael's son, Inge's cousin, and I want to thank Inge for her wonderful explanation of what happened in Germany in those critical years. And since this is Holocaust Remembrance Day, or we're close to it, it's worthwhile to mention that it's important to remember history, or we are destined to repeat it. So hopefully what we are relating today can be avoided in the future. I was born in 1928, January 28, in Schlichten, Germany. And if you can see my cursor, this is where Schlichten is. And Schlichten is part of a district called Hessen, which is probably in this circle. Germany has only been a country, unified country, for about 200 years. And before that, there was nothing but a whole bunch of small principalities, each ruled by its local head of state. Hessen apparently was liberal enough to allow immigrants to come in, because we have records of Jews living in Hessen going back to 1235. And I'll show you a record of that shortly. Schlichten is not very far away from Frankfurt, which is around this area. And this is a main train route, so that today Schlichten is actually a bedroom town for people working in Frankfurt. Westphalia, where Inge came from, is up in this region. And I remember many car trips that the Wolf family took from Schlichten to Beckum to visit the family there, because we were very close. And I can just imagine my sister and I in the car with Dad driving back and forth. And undoubtedly there was a typical question. Sind wir schon angekommen? Are we going to get there? This works. This is a picture of the synagogue that was built in Schlichten in 1898. So evidently there was already a substantial Jewish congregation that could afford to put this together. I do understand that my grandfather, mj.wolf, was a major contributor to this synagogue. You probably also have heard of Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, the night that the Nazis organized the breaking of windows of Jewish stores, breaking into Jewish homes, and destroying Jewish places of worship. On Crystal Night, most of the windows in the synagogue were broken. And later on, that building during the war was used as a manufacturing site. After the war, it was restored. And in 1998, 100 years after it was built, the town invited back all the Jews that survived that they could find. And the town paid for a plane fare, a hotel, and food for the week, and celebrated the return of families that had lived there for a long time. There's been a Jewish cemetery in Schlichten for a very long time, which gives evidence of the length of time that Jews were able to settle there. And these are gravestones that may go back to the 12th, 13th century. It's hard to tell. But I took this picture in 1998 when we went back to visit. And that visit consisted of my wife and I, and our daughter Kate, and my sister Anne, and her husband Willard, and their daughter Debbie. The six of us were part of a group of probably about 25, 26 returnees. A bit of history is worthwhile reciting here. The family name wasn't always Wolf. It was once Lobo. And the name Lobo goes back to Spain. And the family lived in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition, where anti-Semitism was also practiced. The Spanish royalty decreed that Jews should either emigrate, leave the country, or convert to Christianity. So many Jews left Spain through Portugal and then up the Atlantic coast to Holland, and from Holland into Germany. And this is how the Lobos arrived in Schlichten back in 1698. There are records in the town of Schlichten with the Lobo name recorded as residents. The German habit of keeping accurate records goes back many years, and as we'll see soon, gets repeated, sadly, during the Holocaust. But back in the early days, the count or first or head of a state kept track of their population by having the church, the local church, keep track of the residents in books that were kept within the church. These books were available for family members, both in the Windmiller family and the Wolf family, to later on create family trees, because it was possible to leaf through these old books and find names and dates. In the old Jewish cemetery in Schlichten, the town, post-war, erected this memorial stone to record past happenings. Here in 1235, there were Jews killed in Fulda, a neighboring town, and there was no cemetery for them in Fulda, so the bodies were brought to Schlichten for burial, which proves the existence of the Jewish cemetery at that time. Sadly, there was a recurrence of slaughtered Jews in 1349 in Hanau, Hanau is another city near Schlichten, closer to Frankfurt. And then the city of Schlichten memorialized the Jews killed in the Holocaust when they put this stone up in 1949, and they showed 122 Schlichten Jews who lost their lives. The town also put up these memorial stones in the Jewish cemetery and listed the 122 names of Jewish residents who lost their lives during the Holocaust. And there's a stone I can't see, but you may be able to see it here on the right corner. The city of Schlichten has done a great deal to memorialize their lost fellow citizens, and we have to give them great credit for that. I should mention that because of my work, I had opportunities to travel to Germany during my European travels for 10 years and found so many German residents who were helpful in remembering the fate of the Jews. During the 1998 visit, we also saw that gravestones in the community cemetery, which had a Jewish section, had well cared for stones. And this was the gravestone of my grandmother, Jenny Wolf, who died while I was still very young. And this is our daughter, Kate. At that gravestone. A bit of history I won't go into this time, but Kate met a German high school girl during our visit with whom she maintained contact. And that German girl visited us many times, and Kate and her partner and son attended the German wedding of that young lady, and we are still Facebook friends to this day. Thank you, Marie. Following Inge's lead of publishing a family genealogy, I updated the Wolf Family Chronicle in the year 2000. And this is a list of Wolf family victims of the Holocaust that we included in that book. My grandfather in 1932 put the first Wolf Family Chronicle together. There was a subsequent copy printed by a cousin in England, a third edition where my father did the research and my cousin in England published the book. And you can see the size of the former books. In 2000, following the lead of the Windmillers, I published the fourth edition, and Michael has a copy of this book, as he mentioned to you. And it has not only the history of the family, the genealogy, and I managed to collect pictures of family members, which were published, and then a series of essays that family members wrote about their personal history. In the back was an index, and the index and the whole book on microfiche is actually available in the Latter-day Saints libraries on microfiche throughout the world. It's interesting how these things reproduce themselves. In my book, there's also a list of the 122 victims from the town of Schlichten. And that same list is again shown in the cemetery, the old Jewish cemetery in Schlichten. And because the gravestones are kind of out of sight in a fenced area, the visitors in 1998 put a fund together so that the city put up this memorial right next to the gate, so all passers-by could see the result of the Holocaust in their town. The Wolf family, having been in Schlichten for hundreds of years, ended up in the soap business. And the history goes back to where my great-grandfather, or possibly my great-great-grandfather, was traveling the area collecting spent fat from housewives, which he then sold to someone who added lye to make soap. To combine lye and fat, you end up with soap. And after Napoleon overran Germany and liberalized the work available for immigrants, and also, by the way, demanded that everybody had a surname, so the name Lobo became Wolf during Napoleon's time in Germany. My great-grandfather started to make soap, collecting fat, adding lye, and selling laundry soap to the population. This is the factory that my grandfather, mj.wolf, ran until my father and my uncle Hugo took over the operation. This picture obviously is before automobiles were used for transportation. But this office building in the front was also not only the office on the main floor, but the home of the Wolf family on the second floor. And my father and mother had an apartment on the second floor. And I used to kid my sister, she was born in a hospital, but I was actually born in one of these rooms in 1928. It didn't take long for my parents to get tired of living in this small apartment with 2 children. So in 1931, my family of 4 moved into this new house built on the hillside above Schlichten. The architects were the Bauhaus designers from Berlin. And you recognize the modern architecture that was replicated many times when the Bauhaus architects fled Germany during Hitler's days. So we have a lot of this type of architecture in the United States. You can probably see 2 little bodies here. This is probably me and my sister Anne and my mother keeping an eye on us, playing in the yard back in the 30s. And We lived here until 1938, when the house was taken over by the family that took over the soap factory. Of course, these were Nazis from Berlin, who through their connection with the Nazi Party were able to acquire Jewish property. This picture was taken in the backyard of that house and shows 10 cousins sitting together on a sunny day. And interestingly, 8 of us survived. And going along the front row, on the right corner is my sister Anne. Anne now lives in Seattle and is about to turn 91. This is my first cousin Edith, Hugo Wolf's daughter. And she is now living in Israel. Her parents immigrated to Israel in 1937 or 38, as did my grandfather, Maya, who eventually joined my family in New York, where he passed away. This is a picture of me. I don't look very happy there. And next to me is my cousin Lainey Fleece, now Lainey Charles, living in Florida. Next to her is Gretel Lilienfeld Lindenthal. Gretel and her brother Kurt, with their parents, immigrated to Paris in the late 30s, and were living there. Well, the father had passed away, but mother and the 2 children were there when the Germans overran France during World War II. Sadly, Kurt was deported to a concentration camp and didn't survive. But Lenny and her mother survived in Vichy, France, where many Jews were able to hide and eventually come back to Paris to try and regain family connections. In the back row is my cousin Sid Mantle, and at the other end is his brother Alfred. Sid and Alfred's parents allowed Sid to leave Germany on a Kindertransport. That was a train full of Jewish kids that was allowed to go to England, where the children were taken in by English families. And Sid survived that way. They felt Kurt was too young and kept him at home. And sadly, all 3 didn't survive. The 2 parents and Kurt were killed in the Holocaust. The other 2 cousins, there is Fred Elsner, and Fred ended up living in New York City, where I spent a lot of my growing up years as a youth. So we got to see Fred a lot. And Lou Rice also ended up with his parents in New York City. His father was an auto mechanic and had an auto repair shop in Schlichten. And he and his sister and parents ended up living in Queens, about a block from my parents and my sister and me. A bit more history. Both I and Anne were unable to continue our schooling in Schlichten. So first my parents sent one of us at a time to live with a family of teachers in Frankfurt, and we attended a Jewish school called the Philanthropy. After 1 year in 1936, Anne was sent to a boarding school in England. In 1937, I followed, and then both Anne and I were in a boarding school in Bournemouth, England, until 1938, when my parents escaped Germany because of my aunt on the Wolf side, having been in England, in London, and being able to give my parents a visitor visa to escape Germany after Crystal Night. So all four of us were living in England when our US immigration number came up in April 39. So we got on a German boat. My parents had paid for passage. When Jews were allowed to leave Germany, they could leave with about 10 marks each in their pocket, no more. The Germans confiscated bank accounts, but with help from others and a prepaid passage on a German boat, the four of us, actually with a fifth person from Germany, who was a Catholic girl who wanted to leave Hitler. The five of us landed in New York in April 39 and started our new life. In New York, my father had to make a living for his family, and having learned the soap making business in Germany, he was a younger son, so he didn't have the formal education. He had the practical education on how to manufacture the product. So in Queens, New York, he ended up working in a small soap factory that made highly perfumed soap for companies like Elizabeth Arden, Helena Rubinstein, and it was interesting. He took the subway home and very often smelled like the highly perfumed soap that the manufacturer put out. And he would come home and relate what people were looking at him at. Kind of funny with his very sweet odor. But he worked very hard, as you can see, in spite of having been injured as a German soldier in World War I. He got injured by a British rifle. As a result, his right elbow was stationary for the rest of his life. He could never reach his face with his right hand. But as you can see, he was able to mix a very thick kettle of soap successfully. Having worked hard, he lived a long, happy life. And in the senior years, he retired into a care home in Bellingham, Washington, where my sister lived with her husband who taught at the university. And here is a gathering of family around him. And here's my dad. And he's surrounded by 2 children, 5 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren, and assorted spouses right here. I have to admit, this is me, and my sister's back here, her husband Willard, and I'm not going to go through the rest of the family in detail. My wife Vivian. I think it's important to realize that a lot of the history is available in our literature today. And the town of Schlichten hired a professional historian. Christine Whitrock, who actually ended up living on an island off Spain while she was doing her writing. She came back to Schlichten and researched the history of the Wolf family in the soap business, both in Schlichten and Steinau. The larger Steinau factory pictured here was started by my grandfather's brother when they decided to split up and divide the market in the country between themselves. The brother was very much involved in fighting the Nazis. So he immigrated, he was forced to immigrate to England back in 1936. He ended up manufacturing in England. And his son Gerald was very helpful later on in helping with the Wolf family chronicle development. So family stayed tied together. This book was translated to English by a cousin of Gerald Wolf's in Canada, and tells a lot of the family history. Also in book form is a memory of Laurie Shelley, who as a young girl learned to type and ended up in a concentration camp. And the Germans put her and other young Jewish girls to work as typists to keep a record of every individual who was put to death in the Auschwitz concentration camp. Laura survived, and having overcome tuberculosis in Switzerland, finally immigrated to the US, earned a PhD, and became an author. And if you Google Laura Shelley's name, you will find she has at least 5 books that she authored. One of them, Secretaries of Death. She had other survivors participate in recording what they did in Auschwitz during those awful years. So while we have records of sad occurrences, we also have some very positive books to look at. Helinda Kerbel comes post-war Germany and decided to travel. She's a professional photographer and author, and she traveled the world to record the photographs and histories of surviving Jews in every continent, every country she could visit. And this book you'll find on Amazon, still available. Records politicians, musicians, scientists, every kind of profession where people made a mark post-war. And her purpose was to show the German population what they missed by having expelled or killed their Jewish population. Also, as Inge mentioned, on the positive side, there were rescuers in every country that the Nazis overran who hid Jews to keep them from being exterminated. And this book is also available on Amazon today. I have a copy at home. Rescuers, Portraits of Moral Courage in the Holocaust. And these are all Christians who hid Jews at the risk of their own lives. And it's the kind of story that we know well from the Anne Frank story that has become very well known. I thank you for relating my story to you, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We should.
So I think we have a few minutes remaining. Now I got you. So might any of you have any questions either for Inge or Ernie, or have any of your own stories that you have to relate? Certainly, all of us don't have the privilege to be, I shouldn't say how old Inge is, but I don't think Ernie will mind me saying he's 89 years old. And I hope that I'm like that at 89. I won't be able to tell stories about my grandfather in Napoleon's day, right? But hopefully some ski stories at least. What either questions might any of you have for them? What kind of comments might you have to what you heard? Or your own tales that you might relate from that era?
A question for Inge. How was it that Virginia came to establish a Holocaust museum so early, so to speak? I drive through Richmond all the time, and I notice it on the side of the of I-95, and I just didn't know it had been there so long.
Yes, you see it as you drive north on 95 coming through Richmond. It's very near that highway. What was your question? Do you have a question?
Yes, how was it founded?
How is it founded?
Yes, it's so early, the
It
original one.
was started by a man named J. Ibsen, who was a survivor. He was from Lithuania, and farmers allowed his father to dig a hole in a potato field under the potato field and create a underground shelter where 13 people eventually, most of them family members, lived for, I think, 9 months. Jay was a little boy, and they lived underground, literally underground. And he came to Richmond with his parents later. His father had been a lawyer in Germany, in Lithuania, in Kovno, Lithuania. But in Richmond, they had a filling station. And yeah, anyway, friends said to Jay, You know, you're going around to schools telling your story, having to carry with you these memorabilia, boots, and things that, why don't you start a museum, someplace where the children can come and see everything? And he said, no, we're too close to Washington. There's a wonderful museum there. And when they went to Ewsom in Washington, they were told that's not a problem, you should do it. And in fact, they assisted. We have stones from the Warsaw Ghetto at our museum, rails that led to Treblinka. And together with Al Rosenbaum and Mark Fetter, J. Ibsen founded the museum. And in front stands a cattle car, from Germany. It was shipped over. The survivor whose quote, "Hate hurts," Alex Liebenstein, arranged for that. So that's how it was founded. Does that answer your question? And last year, 48,000 visitors came through. I was just there yesterday when we remembered Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance, and that number was shared with the audience.
Other questions, comments, or anything from any of the regions?
If you want to know more about Emek Sholom Holocaust, there is a website. It's very simple, www.holocaustcemetery.org. And you can hear speeches, see programs there. You see the names of all the people who are remembered on the memorial, and you can hear survivors reading those names, the names of their family members on the memorial. holocaustcemetery.org.
I have a question. How were Jewish citizens treated in Bern and Beckham before the Nazis?
Any other questions or comments?
Somebody's trying to speak.
There is a question coming from one of the regions, and I heard the first part, and unfortunately the speakers aren't able to hear the questions from the region, so we'll have to translate. But you were asking, how were Jewish citizens treated before the war?
Before the Nazis gained prominence, whether or not they experienced discrimination in those towns before the Nazis gained power.
So the question is, how were Jewish citizens treated in your communities before the Nazis were able to take power?
Ernie, you want to take that one?
I think I understood. I'm not hearing the question too well, but before the Nazis took over, I am not aware that there was much anti-Semitism. The Wolf family was very much integrated into the Schlichten society. We were one of the major employers, and I guess that was appreciated. I have a picture of my dad and my uncle at the factory with about 100 employees at some celebration. And this was in 1937 or so. And you could see 2 or 3 Nazis sitting amongst the group, which illustrated that at that time, they were forced to hire Nazis into the organization so that they could be spied upon, basically. But before Hitler's time, I think there was a good relationship between the Christians and the Jews in town. Admittedly, going back to the early gravestones I showed you, back in the 12th, 13th century, you had periods of time where there was anti-everything. The Crusaders traveled the world, but also the Crusaders allegedly killed the Jews in Fulda in 1235. But as you will know from history, you might have learned, the Crusaders traveled the world and slaughtered anybody and everybody who didn't have their belief. And so, sadly, we have reminiscences of things that are going on today with ISIS, where all non-believers are readily slaughtered. But in the 1800s, 1900s, I think things were quite compatible in Schleswig as far as I'm aware.
I think the same was true in Beckham. I have pictures of my mother with her school friends dressed up in costumes, and I can only judge by her childhood. Yeah.
So maybe in the last couple minutes, let me just say, first of all, thank you very much to both Inge and Ernie for what they've done. It took a lot of preparation on their part. And I want to thank them for their time, not just today, but for the last several weeks that they've worked hard to prepare for this. I also want to thank Gina for even thinking of the idea and for asking whether there's any interest in doing this. So thank you for being the initiator of the thought, and certainly for FLRA leadership for finding this to be something worthwhile to spend time on. And I also want to thank Rita, who you may have heard her in the background.
My daughter.
Who has been very helpful in helping.
Yes, and Michael, if there's one more minute, I just looked. I'm wearing the white rose. This is symbolic of a group of students in Germany, not Jewish, who were upstanders. You can Google the White Rose. I think a film was made about them. And we use this as a fundraiser for Holocaust education. They did everything they could to counteract what was going on. They printed leaflets and distributed them. There were just not enough of them.
They were killed.
Yes.
And maybe along that line, I'd like to finish by saying that oftentimes when we're asked to think about the Holocaust, people's minds go to the horrible things that happened to Jews and to Catholics and to many others as well. But the aftermath, hopefully, is that by learning from history, we learn how to be better in our lives, and we learn how to help others be better in their lives, and we realize that for all the wickedness that exists in the world, that there's a lot of goodness as well, and it's good to focus on the good parts, not just the bad parts, and to go forward and build on those good parts, and not just dwell on the horrible things that happen. I was fortunate enough to spend time in Germany myself when I was younger. And I worked in a chemical factory in Germany for a while. Actually, the very first union I ever joined. You had to join the union to work in that chemical factory. And while I was there, some found out that this Jewish kid was working there from America. And this guy came up and he said, I want you to come spend a weekend.
He introduced you.
And I learned that he was a Nazi officer during the Second World War. And he worked there in that factory. And he wanted me to live with his family for a week, both as a way for him to personally share his humanity and to make sure that he did whatever he could in his personal life to mend in whatever way there was to mend. So I think that part of what we learn from is not only what happens to them, but also what happens to us, and hopefully sharing some personal stories where the word I can actually be used rather than they makes a difference. So thank you for spending this time, and I hope it's been worthwhile. Inge and Dad, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
It was a privilege.
Yeah.